A wooden door stood in the face of a cliff, nearly invisible against the red gold stone. Snow drove sideways through the darkness, and the wind screamed like something alive and furious. 4 men knelt in the drifts before that door, their beards frozen white, their hands too stiff to make fists. They had walked for half a day through cold that could stop a heart, and now they knelt because their legs had given out, because pride had given out, because everything they once believed about themselves had been stripped away by the storm and the silence and the miles of white nothing behind them. Inside, warmth. A fire burning low and steady. The smell of dried herbs and pine resin and stone that had absorbed heat for weeks. And a young woman standing just behind the door, her hand on the latch, her breath visible in the thin draft that crept through the seams. She was 19 years old. She had built this place with her own bleeding hands. And she did not open the door. Not yet. Because the men kneeling outside were the same men who had taken everything from her. The same men who had stood in a church and voted to send her into the wilderness to die. The same men who had laughed when she tried to warn them about what was coming. And what was coming had come. But that moment at the door, that moment when mercy and justice stood on opposite sides of a wooden latch, happened later, months later. First, there was a town below the mountains. First, there was a warning no one wanted to hear. First, there were 2 sisters who had just buried their father with their own hands, digging through frozen ground for 4 days until their fingers were raw and their backs would not straighten. And neither of them had cried, because there was no one left to cry to. Their father had died the way the mountains take people, suddenly and without apology. A rock slide on the North Ridge, a place he had walked 1,000 times before, and the mountain simply decided that the 1,001st time would be different. They found him beneath the stones, with his journal still in his coat pocket, the last entry half finished, the ink smeared by rain that had come after the rocks. A sentence that stopped in the middle of a thought, a pen that had fallen from a hand that would never pick it up again. Marin kept the pen. Serene kept the journal. And between those 2 objects lay everything their father had known about how to survive in a world that did not care whether you survived or not. That was late summer. By the time the first real bite of autumn sharpened the morning air, the sisters had been alone for weeks. They lived on the land their father had claimed years ago, a stretch of prime forest and clean water on the North Ridge above town, with a cabin their father had built with his own hands, and a view of the valley that went on forever. Their mother was buried on the eastern slope, beneath a stone their father had carved. Their father now rested beside her. The cabin still smelled like him, like wood shavings and tobacco, and the particular warmth of a man who had spent his life close to the earth. Every morning, Serene woke before dawn and read a page of their father's journal by candlelight. His handwriting was small and precise, the writing of a man who valued accuracy over beauty. He had filled hundreds of pages with observations about weather patterns, animal behavior, soil composition, construction techniques, the medicinal properties of plants. knowledge passed down from his father and his father's father before that. Men who had survived in the high country by paying attention to what the land was telling them when no one else would listen. Every morning, Marin fed the chickens and talked to Ashwood while she worked. Ashwood was their father's dog, a half-wolf hybrid with a gray coat and amber eyes, and a way of watching humans that suggested he understood more than any animal should. He was enormous, nearly 100 pounds, and he moved through the world with the quiet confidence of a creature that feared nothing, because nothing in these mountains outmatched him. He had grieved their father in his own way, spending 3 days lying on the porch where their father used to sit, refusing food, his muzzle resting on his paws. On the 4th day he rose, walked to Saren, pressed his head against her thigh, and from that moment transferred his loyalty to her completely. But it was Marin he spoke to. Marin, who understood the slight tilts of his ears, the different qualities of his silence, the way his breathing changed when weather was coming or strangers were near. This was their life in the weeks after the burial. Quiet, painful, ordinary in the way that grief makes everything ordinary, flattening the colors of the world until even sunlight seems gray. Serene checked her father's trap lines each morning and read his journal each night. Marin tended the animals and the garden and sang the old songs their mother had taught them, her voice carrying across the clearing in the evenings, thin and sweet and heartbreaking. They did not talk about the future, because the future was a country they could not yet see, and the present was hard enough. But Saren was watching the animals. She could not help it. Her father had trained her eyes the way a musician trains the ear, to notice patterns that most people overlooked. And what she was seeing in the weeks after his death frightened her in a way that nothing else had. Not the rock slide, not the burial, not the empty chair at the table where her father used to sit. The beaver dams on the upper creek were twice their normal height. The elk were moving down from the high country a full month earlier than usual, their coats so thick they looked like different animals. The woolly bear caterpillars were solid black from head to tail, without a single brown band. The squirrels were burying acorns in a frenzy she had never witnessed, working from first light until dark with a desperation that looked almost like panic. And Ashwood would not stop staring north. Every evening he stood on the ridge behind the cabin and faced the direction the wind came from, his ears flat, his hackles raised, a low sound in his throat that was not quite a growl and not quite a whine, but something older than either. Every sign her father had taught her to read was saying the same thing. They were all saying it, louder than she had ever heard. The morning she walked into the general store in town, the air had a blade in it. Seren was tall and lean from mountain living, with dark hair pulled back in a practical braid, and eyes the color of storm clouds. Marin followed close behind, 17 and softer in her features, with their mother's gentle mouth and their father's watchful gaze. The store fell quiet when they entered, the way it always did. The Ashcroft sisters had that effect on people, the way a hawk circling overhead silences the smaller birds. Not because they were dangerous, but because they were different. And in a small town below the mountains, different was the thing people forgave least. Seren walked to the center of the store, where 3 women examined fabric and 2 men argued about the price of winter feed. She waited until she had their attention, which took only a moment. "The beaver dams on the upper creek are double their usual height," she said. Her voice was calm and clear and carried the kind of certainty that made comfortable people uncomfortable. "The elk have come down a full month early. Their coats are thicker than they should be. The woolly bear caterpillars are solid black, every one of them. Every animal in these mountains is preparing for something none of them have faced before. The winter that is coming will kill anyone who is not ready." The silence that followed was not the silence of people thinking. It was the silence of people deciding how to dismiss what they had heard. Marin spoke then, quietly, because she could not bear the silence. "Their father had saved lives once," she said, "during an ice storm years ago. He predicted it days before it came. The families who listened survived. Many of the families who did not were not so fortunate." Reverend Silas Thornfield stepped forward from the shadow near the dry goods shelf. He was a tall man, narrow through the shoulders, with a beard trimmed to a careful point and eyes that moved constantly, cataloging, assessing, calculating the value of everything they touched. When those eyes settled on Marin, something shifted behind them. Something that had nothing to do with God and everything to do with opportunity. "Your father is dead, child," he said. His voice carried the practiced warmth of a man accustomed to being believed without question. Whatever gifts he imagined he possessed did not save him from the mountain that took his life. And now you stand here, 2 orphan girls without family or proper guardianship, spreading fear among honest folk. He turned to the crowd that had gathered, drawn by raised voices and the scent of spectacle. He spoke the way he always spoke, with the measured cadence of a man who understood that power was not seized, but offered by people who preferred someone else to think for them. "I have hesitated to speak of this matter, but conscience compels me. The Ashcroft claim on the North Ridge has no clear legal standing. Their father never properly filed his homestead papers. These girls are not of age to hold the land. By rights, the claim should return to the public trust." "Or to the church," someone murmured, too softly for the Reverend to place the voice. But Thornfield heard it, and something like satisfaction moved across his face before he smoothed it away. Serene understood then. The understanding came all at once, the way a key turns in a lock, and everything that had confused her for weeks became suddenly and terribly clear. She understood why Thornfield had opposed them at every turn since their father's death, why he had preached against their family from his pulpit, wrapping his sermons in concern while his eyes measured the timber on their ridge, why he had whispered about their mother's death and their father's solitary ways. He wanted their land, the forest and the clean water and the spring that never froze, the land where their mother was buried, the land where they had buried their father with their own hands. Thornfield did not care about their souls. He cared about their property, and he had been planning this long before the words left his mouth. A chair scraped against the floor. Bridget Holmgren stood up. She was past 60, built like a fence post, with hands that had delivered calves and split cordwood and buried a husband without shedding a tear where anyone could see. She had outlasted everything this valley had thrown at her, and she did not care who knew it. "These girls may be young," Bridget said, and her voice carried the rough authority of a woman who had earned every word. "They may be orphans. They may be strange and wild and different from us. But their father knew things about this land that none of you have troubled yourselves to learn. When he told me to stock extra feed before that ice storm, I listened. My cattle lived when half the herds in this valley froze to death. When he told me to brace my roof, I listened. My cabin held when others collapsed." She pointed a gnarled finger at the Reverend. "And I notice, Reverend, that you are mighty eager to claim land that happens to border your own property. Land with the best timber and the cleanest spring in the entire valley." Thornfield's face colored, but his voice remained smooth as oiled leather. "Perhaps you should remember, Widow Holmgren, that your own position in this community is not so secure that you can afford to cast accusations at a man of God." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Bridget let it land and did nothing with it. She had buried a husband and raised children alone in country that punished weakness, and she was not a woman who frightened. But she was one voice, and the room was filling with voices that wanted to agree with the Reverend, because agreement was easier than preparation, and mockery was easier than admitting fear. Callum Bryce stood. He was the largest rancher in the valley, a man whose opinion carried weight because he owned more cattle and more land than anyone else within a day's ride. He had a broad face, weathered by decades of wind and sun, and the absolute confidence of a man who had never been proved wrong about anything that mattered to him. "I have lived in this valley for most of my life," he said. "There is nothing unusual about this autumn. The signs these girls describe are the imaginings of a dead man who spent too much time alone. I will not be frightened by children's tales." Dr. Abel Crane nodded from his seat near the window. He was thin and precise, and devoted to the idea that the modern world had outgrown the old one. "Superstition is not science," he said. "We are not primitive people who read the future in caterpillars. I have consulted the almanacs and the weather reports. There is no indication of anything beyond an ordinary winter." Virgil Dawson called out from near the door, his voice bright with the particular cruelty of young men who have not yet suffered enough to develop compassion. $5 says their little cave idea falls apart before the first real frost. Any takers? Laughter rippled through the room. And the laughter decided things more certainly than any argument could have. Because laughter is how a community tells its members what is permitted and what is foolish, who belongs and who does not, what truths will be tolerated and what truths will be punished. Thornfield smiled the smile of a man who had won a game that was rigged before the first card was dealt. He announced that the Ashcroft property would be held in trust by the church. The sisters would have until dawn to gather their personal effects and leave. Seren looked around the room at the faces of her neighbors. Some could not meet her eyes. Others stared with the satisfied expression of people who had eliminated a problem without thinking too carefully about whether the solution was just. Bridget Holmgren studied her own hands, her jaw tight. Arvid, the grizzled trapper who sat alone near the back door, a man who had lived in these mountains longer than memory reached, met Seren's eyes without flinching. His face held no mockery. It held something that looked like sorrow. And beneath the sorrow, something that looked like belief. And at the far end of the room, standing in the shadow where the lamplight barely reached, Fenrir Bryce stood, with his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Callum's eldest son had his father's shoulders, but not his father's certainty. He had wanted to speak. The words had been ready, pressing against his teeth, demanding to be said. That taking someone's land while calling it duty was a kind of theft that no amount of scripture could sanctify. That these two girls deserved to be heard. That silence in the face of injustice was its own kind of lie. But his father's voice had filled the room first, enormous and unquestionable. And Fenrir had looked at his father's face and seen the absolute conviction there, and the words had retreated down his throat like animals returning to their burrows at the approach of something dangerous. Serene saw him standing there. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and she read everything in his face: the guilt, the wanting, the failure. She held his gaze for one long moment, long enough for him to understand that she had seen his cowardice and measured its weight, and then she turned away without a word, because silent sympathy purchased nothing. It built no shelter. It kept no one warm. They left before dawn. Seren carried her father's journal wrapped in oilcloth against her chest, close enough to feel its weight with every step. Marin carried a bundle of dried herbs and the few tools they had been allowed to keep. Ashwood walked between them through the pre-dawn darkness, his ears forward, his stride easy and certain. The town slept behind them, and the mountains waited ahead, and neither sister looked back, because looking back was something you did when you expected to return, and they did not expect to return. They walked north through the whole of the day, following trails that were not really trails, but the memory of paths their father had shown them years ago. The light moved across the sky, and the shadows lengthened, and the air grew colder as they climbed. Marin began to limp in the afternoon, a blister forming on her heel, but she said nothing about it because there was nothing to say. You did not complain about blisters when you had nowhere to sleep, and winter was gathering in the north like an army massing beyond the hills. It was late afternoon when Seren found the crack in the cliff face. She would have walked past it. She almost did. But Ashwood stopped, pressed his nose into the narrow opening, and his tail moved once, slowly, a gesture Seren had learned to read the way her father had taught her. Animals noticed what human eyes were too proud to see. She turned sideways and slipped through the fissure. Inside, the air changed. It was warmer than the autumn chill beyond the rock, as though the stone held some memory of summer that it released slowly, reluctantly, the way the earth releases the last heat of a dying fire. The crack opened into a shallow depression, perhaps 4 feet deep, sheltered on 3 sides by solid sandstone. Above, a natural overhang reached out like a roof of stone. Below, the floor was smooth and tilted gently toward the entrance. Seren pulled out the journal and turned to the pages she had read so many times the paper was soft at the edges. Her father's small, precise handwriting filled the margins with observations and calculations. He had written about the thermal properties of sandstone, about caves that held steady temperatures through the coldest months. about the principles of earth-sheltered construction passed down through generations of mountain people. A cave carved into the right stone will hold warmth through the worst winter, he had written. The mountain becomes the wall, the ceiling, the shield. A small fire can heat such a space using a fraction of what a wooden cabin demands. You do not fight the cold, you let the mountain fight it for you. Saren stood in the shallow depression with the journal in her hands and the fading light turning the walls to amber. The stone was cool against her palm, solid, patient, old beyond any human reckoning. She heard Marin squeeze through the crack behind her, heard her sister's breath catch as she felt the change in temperature. "We are not going to the capital," Serene said. "We are not going to any institution. We are going to carve a home into this mountain. We are going to make this crack into a room. And when winter comes, we will be warm, while everyone in that town freezes in their wooden houses." Marin ran her fingers along the sandstone wall, testing its hardness, her eyes already measuring the space the way their father measured everything, with precision and patience. "How long do we have?" she asked. Serene studied the sky through the crack, the quality of the light, the way the clouds were building against the peaks. She thought about the beaver dams and the elk and the black caterpillars and all the signs she had been reading since their father died. "A few weeks," she said. "Maybe more if we are lucky. The first snows will come early, but the deep cold will hold off a while longer." "And if you are wrong?" The question was not cruel. It was necessary. Because they were alone now, completely and utterly alone, and the truth mattered more than comfort. Seren met her sister's eyes. "Father was never wrong about the weather," she said. "His father was never wrong. This knowledge has been passed through generations of people who survived by listening to what the land was saying." But her voice trembled on the last word. A small thing, barely there, but Marin heard it because Marin heard everything. It was the sound of a young woman who carried her father's knowledge but had never been the one to stake her life on it, who had always stood behind him, learning, watching, trusting his certainty the way a person trusts the ground beneath their feet. And now the ground was gone, and she was standing on nothing but the memory of his voice and the words in a journal, and a feeling in her gut that she desperately hoped was wisdom, and not just grief dressed up as conviction. She closed the journal, straightened her spine, pushed the trimmer down to a place where Marin could not hear it. "We start today," she said. "We work every hour of daylight. We stop when the job is done, or when there is no daylight left to work by." Marin looked at her sister for a long moment. She looked at the stone walls, at the shallow space that needed to become deep enough and wide enough to shelter 2 young women and a 100-pound wolf dog through the worst cold either of them could imagine. She looked at their hands, calloused but untested by anything like the work that was being asked of them now. Then she nodded. "We should name this place," she said. Seren considered the suggestion. A name was a serious thing. A name turned a crack in a rock into a home. A name was a promise made to the future by people who had no guarantee that the future would keep its end of the bargain. "Stonehaven," she said. Marin tried the word in her mouth. "Stonehaven." She nodded slowly. It sounds like a place that was here before us and will be here after us. It sounds like something that lasts. Saren picked up a flat stone from the ground and pressed its edge against the sandstone wall. She scraped downward. A thin curl of red gold dust spiraled to the floor, and beneath it the rock was pale and cool and patient. She scraped again. Another curl of dust. Another fraction of an inch closer to a home that did not yet exist. Behind her, Marin picked up a stone of her own and joined her at the wall. Ashwood settled himself at the entrance of the crack, his body blocking the draft, his amber eyes watching the valley below, his ears turning slowly toward the north, where something was gathering that only he and the beaver and the elk and the caterpillars understood. Neither sister spoke. There was nothing more to say. There was only the sound of stone against stone, steady and rhythmic, like a heartbeat, like a prayer, like the first words of a story that the mountain would remember long after the people who carved it were gone. The daylight faded, the cold pressed closer, and two sisters kept working, scraping stone, building a home, one handful of dust at a time. Because there was no other choice, and no other door, and the winter that was coming would not wait for them to be ready. It would come when it chose, and they would be ready, or they would not. And the mountain did not care either way. The first week nearly broke them. Saren worked from the moment light entered the crack in the cliff until the darkness made it impossible to see the stone in front of her face. She used her father's knife, flat rocks she had shaped into crude chisels by smashing them against harder stones until they fractured into edges, and a heavy river rock the size of a man's head that served as a hammer. The sandstone was soft enough to work, but that did not mean the work was easy. It meant that instead of being impossible, it was merely brutal. Each day's labor removed another 4 to 6 inches of depth from the wall. 4 inches. The width of a woman's hand spread flat. That was what 16 hours of pounding and scraping and chipping produced. And at that rate, Serene had calculated that they needed 6 weeks of perfect weather and perfect health to carve a space large enough to survive in. They did not have 6 weeks of perfect weather, and they would not have perfect health. Her hands blistered on the second day. The blisters were not the small, clean kind that form on a palm unused to work. They were deep and ragged, filling with fluid that turned pink with blood, swelling until the skin stretched tight and shiny, and every grip on the chisel sent a shock of pain up through her wrist and into her shoulder. On the 4th day, the blisters burst. The raw flesh beneath was bright red and weeping, and the stone dust worked itself into the open wounds like salt, a constant grinding burn that made her clench her teeth until her jaw ached. She did not stop. Stopping was not something the mountain offered as an option. Marin worked beside her in shifts, one sister carving, while the other gathered food and maintained the crude lean-to they had built against the cliff face as a temporary shelter. They caught rabbits in snares made from strips of rawhide cut from an old belt. They gathered rose hips and pine nuts and the roots of the camas plant, which their father had written about extensively in his journal. They ate twice a day, morning and evening, and the meals were small enough that hunger became a constant companion. a dull ache in the belly that never quite went away and never quite became unbearable. Ashwood proved invaluable. He ranged through the valley each day, his wolf blood making him a hunter of natural and devastating efficiency. He caught ground squirrels and rabbits, sometimes dropping them at the sisters' feet, sometimes eating them himself, always returning before dark to press his warm body between them under the lean-to. His body heat was not a luxury. It was the difference between sleeping and shivering, between rest and exhaustion, between waking with enough strength to work and waking with nothing left. By the end of the first week, the crack had widened into a passage 6 feet deep and 5 feet wide. Not enough to live in, barely enough to shelter from a passing storm. But it was a beginning, and in the depths of that shallow space, when Serene pressed her palm against the back wall and felt the stone's faint warmth, she could almost believe that her father's words were true, that the mountain would hold heat the way he said it would, that the stone would become their wall and their ceiling and their shield. And then the ceiling fell. It happened on a morning when the sky was the color of a bruise, and the wind carried the smell of snow that had not yet arrived. Serene was working at the deepest part of the excavation, chipping at a seam in the sandstone that she thought would open into softer rock beneath. She was wrong. The seam was not a line of weakness in the stone. It was a fracture line, a place where the ceiling above had been holding itself together through pressure and habit. And when she drove her chisel into it one too many times, the pressure released. The sound came first. A crack that was not the sound of her chisel striking rock, but something deeper, something that came from inside the stone itself, like a bone breaking inside a body. Then a grinding, shifting, settling sound, and then the ceiling came down. Serene threw herself backward. Instinct saved her, the reflexes of a woman raised in a place where rock slides were not abstractions, but real and present threats. She hit the ground rolling and felt stone crash into the space where her head had been a half-second before. Felt the wind of it against her face. Felt chips of sandstone pepper her arms and chest like thrown gravel. But Marin was beside her. Marin, who had been working at the wall to the left, sorting rubble into piles, and who did not have the angle to see the fracture line opening above her. A slab of sandstone the size of a saddle caught her left leg just below the knee. She screamed, and the sound bounced off the walls of the shallow cave and echoed out across the valley, and sent birds scattering from the trees along the ridge. When Serene pulled the stone away, her hands shaking, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps, she found a leg that was already swelling, the skin darkening to a purple that spread as she watched. Not broken. She checked the way their father had taught them, running her fingers along the bone, feeling for the grinding shift that meant a fracture. The bone was intact, but the tissue around it was damaged badly enough that when Marin tried to stand, she collapsed immediately, her face going the color of old snow, her lips pressed together so tightly they disappeared. "Can you walk?" Serene asked, already knowing the answer. Marin shook her head. "Not today. Maybe not for a while." Serene looked at the cave. Half of what they had carved in a week of brutal labor was now filled with rubble from the ceiling collapse. The wall she had been working on was cracked in a pattern that meant the stone was unstable, that everything they had built in that direction would need to be abandoned and started again from a different angle. 2 weeks of work. Gone. Worse than gone, because now they had less time and one less pair of working hands. She looked at the sky, which was darker than it had been an hour ago. She looked at the supplies they had gathered, which were enough for perhaps 10 days if they rationed carefully. She looked at Marin's leg, which was swelling visibly, the bruise spreading like ink in water. And she calculated, the way her father had taught her to calculate, without sentiment, without wishful thinking, with nothing but the numbers and what they demanded. The numbers said that what she needed to accomplish in the weeks remaining was not possible for one person working alone. The numbers said that the cave could not be finished in time. The numbers said they were going to die. She did not share this calculation with Marin. Instead, she squared her shoulders the way her father used to square his when the world presented him with something that was not possible but needed to be done anyway. "You will rest," she said. "When you can work again, you will work. Until then, you do what you can from here. Make snares, process the food. Keep the fire burning so that when the light goes, the cold does not take us in the night." Marin's eyes filled with a frustration that was worse than tears. "I am sorry. I should have been watching. I should have seen the crack." Seren knelt beside her sister and took her hand. Their fingers were both rough and torn, the hands of old women on the bodies of girls. "Father broke his arm building his first shelter," she said. "He finished it one-handed because there was no other choice. We are his daughters. We will finish this because there is no other choice." She stood, picked up her chisel, and turned back to the ruined wall. The next 10 days were the loneliest of Seren's life. She worked 16 hours a day, from the first gray light of morning until the darkness was so complete that she could not see the stone in front of her. She carved. She ate standing up, because sitting down meant resting, and resting meant thinking, and thinking meant calculating the numbers again, and the numbers had not changed. She did not think about fairness or justice or the people in the town below who slept in warm beds while she bled into the rock. She thought only about the next inch of stone, the next swing of the chisel, the next curl of red gold dust that meant she was one fraction closer to a space that might keep them alive. Her hands stopped bleeding by the 5th day, not because the wounds healed, but because the calluses grew over them, thick and hard and yellow, turning her palms into something that looked less like skin and more like the bark of an old tree. Her shoulders ached with a deep, constant burn that radiated down through her ribs and up through her neck. Her back seized in the mornings so severely that she had to roll to her hands and knees and push herself upright against the wall before she could stand. She lost weight she could not afford to lose, her face thinning until the bones showed sharp beneath the skin. And in the dark hours, when Marin slept and the fire burned low, and the only sound was the wind moving through the valley, Seren cried. She cried the way people cry when they do not want to be heard, with her face pressed into the crook of her elbow and her body curled tight and the sobs muffled against her own flesh. She cried because she was afraid, because the journal said one thing and the stone said another, and she did not know anymore which one to believe. Because she had told Marin that their father was never wrong. But the truth was that their father had never tried to carve a home into this particular cliff face, and the rock here was harder in places than his journal described, and the fracture patterns ran in directions he had not predicted. She was improvising. She was guessing. She was a 19-year-old girl with a dead man's notebook and bleeding hands, trying to do something that might be impossible. And the only thing standing between her and despair was the fact that despair was a luxury she could not afford. Marin did not waste her injury. She could not carve stone, but she could work with her hands, and she did. She sat propped against the cave wall with her injured leg stretched before her and wove snares from rawhide strips, dozens of them, enough to ring the valley with traps that would catch rabbits and squirrels through the winter. She prepared dried herbs, sorting them into bundles, labeling them with charcoal marks on strips of bark. She kept the fire fed so that Seren could work longer, and in the evenings she sang. The old songs their mother had taught them, and the sound of her voice echoing off the stone walls was the only thing some nights that kept Seren's spirit from splitting apart. And during those long hours of sitting and working and watching the valley from the mouth of the lean-to, Marin noticed the horses. They appeared on the third day of her injury, a small band of wild mustangs grazing in a meadow about a mile from the cliff. Perhaps a dozen animals moving through the autumn grass with the unhurried grace of creatures that belonged to no one and answered to nothing. Marin watched them the way she watched all animals, not as objects, but as beings with their own intentions and their own intelligence. And what she saw on the second day of watching made her breath catch. One mare had been pushed to the edge of the herd. She grazed alone, always several lengths away from the others, and when she tried to move closer, they pinned their ears and snaked their heads and drove her back. She was pregnant, heavily pregnant, her belly swollen and low, and she moved with the careful, wide-legged gait of an animal carrying weight she was not accustomed to. Her coat was the color of dying embers, a red gold that caught the light and turned it to fire. And Marin recognized in her something that required no translation between species. She was cast out, carrying life inside her, vulnerable and alone, and the herd had decided she was not worth protecting. Marin understood that. She understood it in the marrow of her bones. She told Seren that evening, her eyes bright with a possibility that the pain in her leg could not diminish. If she could tame the mare, if she could bring her here before the foal came, a horse for hauling and traveling when the snow cleared, a foal that would grow up tame, and the body heat, two large animals breathing and warming the air through the long, dark months. It could be the difference between surviving and not. Seren looked at her sister and saw the first real light in Marin's face since the ceiling collapse. She calculated again. Time was the thing they could not manufacture, and every hour Marin spent with the horses was an hour not spent on work that needed doing. Do it, she said, but no more than 2 hours each day away from what needs to be done here. We cannot slow our progress. Marin spent the next 8 days approaching the Mustang herd. She used techniques their father had written about, methods he had learned from horsemen of the high country who understood that you did not tame a wild animal by breaking it. You tamed it by becoming part of its world, by existing in the same space without threat, by offering patience until patience became trust. She did not chase. She did not corner. She sat in the meadow grass with her injured leg stretched before her and did nothing. The first 2 days, the horses ignored her. The third day, they watched her. The fourth day, the ember-colored mare came close enough that Marin could see the shape of the foal moving beneath her distended belly. The fifth day, the mare stood 10 feet away and studied Marin with dark, liquid eyes that held a question Marin answered by doing nothing at all. The sixth day, the mare approached. The seventh day, she ate grass from Marin's hand, her soft lips brushing Marin's torn palm with a gentleness that made Marin's throat tighten. The eighth day, the mare followed her home. They named her Sindra. She was perhaps 6 years old, strong despite the pregnancy, and intelligent in the way that wild animals must be to survive. She accepted the sisters as her new herd, and Ashwood as a strange but tolerable packmate, and the growing cave as shelter far superior to standing in the wind. And Marin, who had felt useless and guilty since the ceiling collapse, who had watched her sister work herself toward breaking while she sat and wove snares, discovered something she had not expected. She discovered that the knowledge their father had passed down did not belong only to Saren. Saren had inherited their father's ability to read weather and stone, and the slow language of geology. Marin had inherited something different, something their father had possessed, but never fully developed, because his attention was always on the mountain and the sky. Marin could read animals. She could sense what they needed before they showed it, could communicate across the gap between species with a fluency that seemed almost like a shared language. Sindra trusted her within days. Ashwood had always trusted her, and in the act of bringing a wild horse into their shelter, Marin proved that she was not simply her sister's helper. She was her sister's equal, carrying a different piece of the same inheritance. Meanwhile, down in the valley town, the autumn deepened, and the world continued as though the Ashcroft sisters had never existed. Reverend Silas Thornfield preached a sermon on the Sunday after the sisters' departure. He spoke of purification, of the removal of ungodly influences, of the blessings that awaited a community that had the courage to cleanse itself. He did not mention the timber he had already begun marking on the Ashcroft land. He did not mention the men he had hired to begin cutting before the first frost. He spoke only of God's plan, and his congregation nodded and murmured their agreement, because nodding was easier than questioning, and murmuring was easier than thinking. Callum Bryce bought more cattle that week. 3 dozen head, fine animals, expensive. He had decided that this winter would be mild, and a mild winter meant good grazing into late autumn, and good grazing meant the cattle would be fat by spring, and the prices would be higher than ever. He did not check the beaver dams. He did not look at the elk. He did not notice that the birds had already gone south weeks earlier than usual, or that his own dogs were restless at night, pacing and whining at the northern windows. Old Arvid noticed. The grizzled trapper who had met Saren's eyes in the store without mockery had gone home that day and begun stacking cordwood against his cabin walls with a quiet, grim determination. He had lived in these mountains longer than anyone, and he had seen winters that killed and winters that merely punished, and he knew the difference as surely as he knew his own heartbeat. He believed the Ashcroft girl. He believed her because her father had been right before, and because the animals were behaving the way animals behave when something terrible is approaching, and because he was old enough to know that certainty was the most dangerous thing a man could carry into a hard season. But Arvid was one man, alone, and the things he believed in silence, because he had learned long ago that the world did not reward people who told truths that others were not ready to hear. And Fenrir Bryce, Callum's eldest son, did something that he told no one about. On the second night after the sisters' departure, he filled a sack with dried meat and hard biscuits and a wool blanket and carried it 3 miles up the north trail and left it on a flat rock at the place where the trail forked toward the high country. He did not know if the sisters would find it. He did not know if it would make any difference. He only knew that his silence in the church had left a weight on his chest that would not shift, and this small, secret act of defiance was the only thing he could think of to ease it. Saren found the sack the next morning when she went to check the snares along the upper trail. She stood over it for a long time, examining the contents, recognizing the quality of the dried meat, the particular way the blanket had been folded. She did not know who had left it, but she took it because pride was another luxury she could not afford, and the blanket was warm, and the food would buy them 3 extra days. Back at Stonehaven, the work continued, and on a night when the fire burned low and Maren slept with Syndra's warmth at her back, Saren opened her father's journal to a page she had not read before. She had thought she knew every word in the book. She had been wrong. In the back, tucked between pages that had stuck together with age and damp, was an entry in handwriting that was less precise than the rest. The writing of a younger man, a man who had not yet developed the careful discipline that characterized his later years. The first cave collapsed, her father had written. Complete failure. 3 weeks of work buried in rubble. The stone was telling me to go one way, and I insisted on going another because I believed I knew better. The mountain does not care what you believe. It cares only what is true. I had to learn to listen to the stone instead of arguing with it. The rock has veins, like a body. Cut along the veins and it opens. Cut against them and it fights you. And the mountain always wins a fight. Saren read the passage 3 times. Then she went to the wall she had been carving and held the lantern close and looked at the stone the way she had never looked at it before. Not as an obstacle to be attacked, but as a structure with its own logic, its own grain, its own willingness to open if asked correctly. She could see it now. The veins her father described, subtle lines in the sandstone where the color shifted slightly, where the texture changed from rough to smooth, where the rock itself was showing her the path if she had the patience to follow it. The next morning she changed her approach. Instead of chipping straight back into the wall, she followed the natural grain of the stone, curving where it curved, deepening where it softened. The difference was immediate. Stone that had resisted her for days began to release in clean, satisfying sheets, falling away almost willingly, as though the mountain had been waiting for her to stop fighting and start listening. The cave began to grow. And then the argument happened. Syndra was close to giving birth. Maren could see it in the way the mare moved, careful and slow, her belly enormous, her breathing shallow. She needed attention, needed monitoring, needed the kind of patient presence that could not be scheduled into a 2-hour window between carving stone and checking snares. "She needs me," Maren said one evening, and the simplicity of the statement was what made it land so hard. Saren looked up from the journal. Her face was gaunt in the firelight, the bones of her cheeks sharp enough to cast shadows. She had lost more weight in the past week. The calluses on her hands were cracked and bleeding again where new blisters had formed beneath the old ones. "We do not have time," Serene said. "Every hour matters. We are behind schedule, and the cold is coming, and the cave is not deep enough, and we cannot afford to lose a single day on a horse that might not even survive the birth." She is not just a horse. She is warmth. She is transport. She is the reason we might live through a winter that lasts longer than our food supply. "And if she dies? If the foal dies?" "Then you have wasted days we did not have on an animal that gave us nothing." Maren's face changed. Something hard came into her expression, something that did not belong on her gentle features, and when she spoke, her voice carried an edge that Serene had never heard before. "You sound like him," Maren said. "Like who?" "Like father. Like someone who sees plans and numbers and schedules, but not the living things standing right in front of her." Father was brilliant, and he loved us, but he was gone half the time, up on some ridge, reading the sky, while we waited at home, wondering if he would come back. And now you are doing the same thing. You are so busy fighting the mountain that you cannot see that Syndra is part of the answer, not a distraction from it. The words hit Saren like the falling stone had hit Maren's leg, sudden and hard, and in a place she was not prepared to defend. Because the accusation was not entirely wrong. She had been so focused on the numbers, on the inches per day, on the calculations of depth and width and time remaining, that she had stopped seeing anything else. She had stopped seeing Maren's pain. She had stopped seeing Ashwood's restlessness. She had stopped seeing anything except the wall in front of her and the fear behind her. But she could not admit that. Not now. Not when admitting it might mean stopping, and stopping might mean dying. "Do what you need to do," she said, and her voice was flat and cold, and she turned back to the stone and did not look at her sister again that night. The argument did not resolve. It sat between them like a third presence in the lean-to, heavy and silent and breathing. They worked side by side the next day without speaking. They ate without speaking. They lay down at night with Ashwood between them, and the fire crackling, and the silence louder than the wind. Syndra's foal came 3 days later, in the small hours before dawn, when the sky was black and the stars burned cold and close. Maren woke to the sound of the mare's distressed breathing and went to her immediately, barefoot on the frozen ground, her injured legs still stiff but bearing weight now. The birth was difficult. The foal was positioned wrong, and Maren had to reach in and turn it, her arms slick to the elbows, her voice steady and low, murmuring words that were not words but sounds, the private language she shared with animals that no human had ever been invited to learn. Serene woke to the sound of her sister singing, a low, tuneless hum that rose and fell with the rhythm of effort and patience. She lay still for a moment, listening, and then she rose and went to the place where Marin knelt beside Sindra in the moonlight. The foal slid free in a rush of warmth and wet. A filly, small and dark, with her mother's ember coloring already visible beneath the birth membrane. Marin cleared the membrane from the filly's face, and the animal took its first breath, a shuddering gasp that became a sound, and the sound became a voice, and the voice filled the cold night air with the unmistakable announcement of something new and alive and determined to exist. They named her Flint, and in the days that followed, as Sindra nursed her foal, and the two horses settled into the shallow cave beside the lean-to, Sarin noticed something that the numbers had not predicted. The cave was warmer. Not dramatically, not miraculously, but measurably, tangibly warmer. The body heat of two horses, one large and one small, radiated into the stone, and the stone held it, and the temperature inside the excavation rose by several degrees. Enough to matter, enough to be the difference on the coldest night between survival and failure. Marin had been right. Sindra was not a distraction. She was part of the design. Sarin did not apologize. She did not know how to apologize in words. But that evening, she sat beside Marin at the mouth of the cave and watched the sunset paint the valley gold, and said, without looking at her sister, "Tell me what else the animals are saying." And Marin, who understood that this was the only apology her sister knew how to make, smiled and began to talk. By the end of the following weeks, the cave had reached dimensions that their father would have recognized. 16 feet deep, 14 wide, 8 feet high at the center, where the natural dome of the stone curved upward. A main chamber large enough for living and working. A fire pit positioned near the entrance, where the smoke rose naturally through a crack in the ceiling that Sarin had carefully widened into a functional chimney. A storage alcove carved into the eastern wall, already filling with dried rabbit meat and rose hips and pine nuts and camas roots. A secondary chamber, smaller but adequate, where Sindra and Flint stood out of the weather, their breath steaming in the cool air, their body heat seeping into the stone like a slow, patient fire. The door was the final piece. They built it from fallen aspen logs, stripped and dried and lashed together with rawhide. Sarin carved a frame into the stone entrance with a precision that surprised even her, fitting the wood so tightly into the rock that it seemed to have grown there. They lined the inside with rabbit fur saved from weeks of trapping, creating an insulated barrier that could be sealed from within. When the door was closed and a small fire burned in the pit, the cave held a warmth that felt almost luxurious after weeks of working in the open cold. The stone walls absorbed heat during the day and released it through the night. The horses added their warmth. The space breathed with a slow, steady rhythm of its own, as though the mountain had accepted them at last, had recognized their effort and their patience, and had decided, in its own ancient and indifferent way, to let them stay. Sarin stood at the entrance of Stonehaven on the evening they sealed the door for the first time and looked out across the valley. The light was leaving the sky in bands of copper and iron. The trees on the far ridge were bare, their branches etched against the darkening sky like cracks in glass. Somewhere below, invisible in the gathering dusk, the town sat in its valley, its wooden houses and its wooden church and its wooden certainties. All of it fragile, all of it combustible, all of it built on the assumption that the worst would never come. Marin appeared beside her. She had been checking the snare lines, and her cheeks were flushed from the cold, and her breath came in small white clouds. "The birds are gone," she said. "All of them. Weeks early." She paused. "And Ashwood will not stop looking north." As if to confirm this, the great wolf dog stood at the edge of the overhang, his body rigid, his ears flat against his skull, his amber eyes fixed on a point beyond the horizon. A sound rose from his chest that was not a growl and not a whine, but something older, something that belonged to a time before dogs were dogs, when his ancestors stood on ridges exactly like this one and felt the same thing moving toward them from the same direction. Saren looked north. The sky above the distant peaks had changed color. It was no longer the clean, deep blue of autumn evening. It was a yellow-gray, the color of a bruise, the color of old bone, a color that did not belong in any sky she had ever seen. The light it cast was flat and strange, turning the snowfields on the highest peaks to the color of ash. Something was building beyond those peaks, something enormous and cold and patient, gathering itself the way a wave gathers before it breaks. "It is coming," Saren said, "sooner than the journal predicted." Marin looked at the sky and at the dog and at her sister's face, and she did not ask if Saren was sure, because the sky and the dog and her sister's face were all saying the same thing, and there was no room left for doubt. "How soon?" she asked. "Days, maybe less." Saren stepped back into the warmth of the cave. She checked the firewood stacked in the alcove near the entrance. Enough for months if they were careful. She checked the food stores, sufficient for weeks of strict rationing. She checked the spring that seeped from a crack in the deepest part of the cave, a thin but constant flow of water that their father's journal said would not freeze because it came from deep in the mountain where the cold could not reach. Then she closed the door and dropped the wooden bar into its brackets and stood in the warm silence of the space she and her sister had carved from living rock. The fire crackled. Sindra shifted her weight in the side chamber. Flint made a small sound in her sleep. Ashwood lay across the threshold, his body blocking the draft beneath the door, his ears still turning toward the north. Marin sat by the fire with their father's journal open on her lap. She was reading the last full entry, the one their father had written the morning of the day he died. His handwriting was steady and sure, his observations precise. His final words, the ones that ended in the middle of a sentence with the ink smeared by rain, were about the color of the sky in autumn and what it meant and what was coming and how to prepare. The sentence stopped. The thought was unfinished. The pen had fallen from a hand that would never pick it up again. But the knowledge remained. In the journal, and in the stone, and in the two daughters who had carried it up the mountain and carved it into the rock, and built something that would hold against whatever was coming from the north. The wind shifted in the night. By morning, the first flakes of snow were falling, small and dry and hard, the kind of snow that does not melt on contact, but accumulates, layer upon layer, with the patient determination of something that intends to stay. Seren watched the snow from behind the sealed door and felt the warmth of the cave at her back and the cold of the world at her face. And she thought of the town below, of the people who slept behind walls that could not hold what was coming, who had laughed at the only warning they would ever receive. She did not feel vindication. She did not feel satisfaction. She felt only the weight of knowing something that others refused to learn, and the quiet, terrible certainty that the price of their refusal would be paid not in pride, but in lives. The snow continued to fall, and deep inside the mountain, the stone held its warmth, and the fire burned, and two sisters waited for the world to learn what they had been trying to teach it all along. The storm did not arrive the way storms usually arrive, with warning and gradual darkening and the slow gathering of clouds that give people time to close their shutters and stoke their fires. This storm came like a door slamming shut on the world. 1 hour, the snow was falling steadily, the kind of heavy winter weather that the people in the valley town had seen 100 times before. The next hour, the wind doubled. Then it doubled again. Then it became something that was no longer wind in any ordinary sense, but a force, a wall of moving air so cold and so fast that it stripped the heat from everything it touched, the way fire strips paint from wood. Inside Stonehaven, the storm announced itself with a sound that Seren had never heard before. A deep, constant roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the sky and the ground and the stone itself, as though the mountain were vibrating with the force of what was being thrown against it. The wooden door shuddered in its frame. Drafts crept through gaps in the construction, thin fingers of cold air that probed the edges of the entrance and found the places where the fit was not quite perfect. But the door held. The stone held. The fire burned steadily in its pit, and the smoke rose through the crack in the ceiling, as it always did, and the temperature inside the cave remained constant. Warm enough to move without shivering, warm enough to sleep without waking in the night to feed the fire. The mountain was doing what their father had promised it would do. It was fighting the cold for them. Marin read aloud from their father's journal, while Seren tended the fire and checked the door. The words were about spring, about the way ice breaks on the creek, and the first green shoots push through the snow, and the birds return to the valley in waves, each species arriving on its own schedule, as predictable as the turning of a wheel. It was a strange thing to read about spring, while the worst winter either of them had ever imagined raged outside. But the words were their father's voice, and his voice was the warmth that no fire could replace. Sindra and Flint stood quietly in their chamber, the mare occasionally nickering softly to her foal, the foal pressing close to her mother's side. Ashwood had pressed himself against the base of the door and stayed there for days, his gray coat dusted with frost that crept through the seams, his ears swiveling slowly in the dark cataloging sounds that the wind carried from places no human sense could reach. On the third night, Seren woke to find him lying with his massive head on her chest, his amber eyes watching her face in the firelight. She placed her hand on his fur and felt him trembling, not with cold, but with something else, some animal knowledge of the scale of what was happening outside. She stroked his head and whispered words that she had never spoken to another living creature. She told him she was frightened. She told him she missed their father. She told him that sometimes, in the darkest hours, she was not sure she had made the right choice, that perhaps they should have gone to the territorial capital and taken their chances with strangers, instead of betting everything on a hole in a cliff. Ashwood's tail thumped once against the stone floor. He pressed his head harder against her chest. He understood loss. He had lost his master, too. And now they were keeping each other alive in the dark, the way family does when the world outside has become a place where family is the only warmth that matters. Far below in the valley town, the world was ending. Not all at once, not dramatically. It was ending the way a candle ends, the flame growing smaller and smaller until the light is gone and there is only smoke and darkness and the smell of something that used to burn. The cattle died first. They died the way cattle die, in cold that exceeds anything their bodies were built to withstand, which is to say, they died standing up. The ranchers who had dismissed the Ashcroft sisters' warnings watched from their windows as their herds froze in the draws and coulees, the animals huddling together, seeking warmth that did not exist, their breath rising in clouds that the wind tore apart before it could form. They died with their eyes open and their legs locked and their bodies turning to ice before they fell. Callum Bryce stood at his parlor window and watched his life's work disappear. He watched them die by the dozens in the first days, then by the score. Then he stopped counting, because counting was just another way of measuring how completely he had been wrong. Fine animals, expensive animals, animals he had purchased with borrowed money because he was certain this winter would be mild. He watched them die, and he did not speak, and his wife Constance brought him coffee that he did not drink, and his son Fenrir stood behind him and wanted to say something and could not find the words. The Dawson homestead lost everything in a single night. Virgil, the young man who had wagered $5 that the sisters' cave would collapse, spent that night carrying his younger sister Eloine through chest-deep snow to the nearest neighbor after their roof buckled under a weight it was never designed to bear. They made it. Barely. Virgil's hands were so badly frostbitten that 2 of his fingers would later turn black, and he would spend the rest of his life looking at those damaged hands and remembering the bet he had made, and the laughter it had produced, and the absolute certainty he had felt that the world would continue to operate according to his expectations. Dr. Abel Crane, the man of science who had dismissed the sisters' warnings with almanacs and weather reports, was trapped beneath the timbers of his own house when the roof gave way under the snow. His leg broke in 2 places, compound fractures that in normal circumstances would require surgery and recovery and the careful attention of another physician. But there was no other physician. He was the only doctor in the valley, and the leg that needed operating on was his own. And the storm that raged outside made it impossible to move him anywhere. He lay on a makeshift bed in a neighbor's house and managed his pain with whiskey, and tried very hard not to think about the conversation in the general store. About the young woman who had stood before him and told him exactly what was coming, and about the almanacs he had chosen to trust instead of her. The wood ran out on the 5th day. Every family in the valley had a wood pile. In an ordinary winter, those piles were more than sufficient. But this was not an ordinary winter, and the cold was consuming fuel at a rate that no one had anticipated. And the storm made it impossible to venture out to cut more without risking death. People burned what they could. Furniture first, then shelving, then the walls of barns and outbuildings, pulling their own structures apart, board by board, to feed stoves that could not keep pace with the cold. The general store lost its counters and its sign. The finest house in town began shrinking room by room as its owner dismantled the east wing to heat the west. And in the church, Reverend Silas Thornfield burned the pews, then the choir risers, then the baptismal font that had been shipped from a city back east at considerable expense. He prayed without stopping, his voice rising and falling through the empty sanctuary. But the storm did not answer, and the cold did not care about his faith, and the fire consumed everything he fed it, and demanded more. Then old Arvid died. He had believed the sisters. He had prepared better than most. His cabin was solid. His woodpile was large. His provisions were ample for a man living alone. He should have survived. By every reasonable calculation, he should have been one of the people who made it through. But he woke one morning to find his fire dead and his wood box empty. Somehow in the night, the cold had crept in deeper than he realized, and the wood had burned faster than he planned, and the margin he had counted on had vanished while he slept. He needed to reach his woodpile just outside his door, a distance he could cross in a few seconds on any normal day. He put on every piece of clothing he owned. He wrapped his face until only his eyes showed. He opened the door. The wind hit him like something solid. It found every gap in his clothing, every seam, every place where fabric met fabric and the seal was not quite perfect. The snow was so thick and so driven that he could not see his own hand if he held it before his face. The world had become a white void in which direction did not exist. Forward and backward and left and right all meant the same thing, which was nothing. Old Arvid had navigated these mountains for longer than most people in the town had been alive. He knew every trail, every ridge, every draw and hollow. He could find his way through these valleys blindfolded on a clear day. But a whiteout is not a clear day with the lights turned off. A whiteout is the erasure of the world itself, the removal of every landmark and reference point and visual cue that the human brain uses to construct its understanding of where it is and which direction it faces. He took 4 steps from his door and was lost. They found him when the snow melted, curled in a drift, like a man who had laid down to sleep. He was less than 20 feet from his cabin. 20 feet from warmth and firewood and survival. He had walked in a circle in the white void and ended up farther from safety than when he started. And the cold had taken him quietly and completely, and without the slightest regard for whether the person it was killing had been right about everything or wrong about nothing. He had been the only person in that town who believed the Ashcroft sisters. And he died alone. Inside Stonehaven, the sisters did not know about Arvid. They did not know about the cattle dying, or the roofs collapsing, or the wood running out, or the doctor lying in a neighbor's house with a shattered leg. They knew only the warmth of their cave, and the sound of the storm outside, and the steady breathing of the horses and the dog, and the knowledge that they had built something that was holding, something that worked, something that their father would have been proud of. But in the Bryce Ranch house, the largest and sturdiest home in the valley, a child was dying. Lachlan was 8 years old. He had been coughing for 3 days when the cough changed into something different, something wet and deep that came from a place in his chest that should not have been producing sound. His mother Constance held him constantly, wrapping him in every blanket they owned, keeping him close to the stove, her hands on his forehead, monitoring a fever that climbed higher each hour. His lips had begun to turn blue. His breathing had become shallow and labored, each inhale a struggle, each exhale accompanied by a rattling sound that made Constance's face go white every time she heard it. The boy needed a doctor. The only doctor in the valley was lying in a neighbor's house with a broken leg. The boy needed medicine. There was no medicine. The boy needed warmth and clean air and nourishment, and the house was growing colder despite the stove, because the wood was running low, and the storm showed no sign of breaking, and the walls of a wooden house, no matter how well built, could not hold heat the way stone could. On the evening that Lachlan's fever spiked so high that his small body began to shake and his eyes rolled back, and his mother's prayers became a sound that no one in the house could bear to hear, Callum Bryce sat down at his kitchen table and put his face in his hands. He stayed that way for a long time. His wife's prayers filled the house. His son's breathing filled the silences between the prayers. The wind filled everything else. When he raised his head, his face had changed. The certainty was gone. The confidence that had carried him through decades of ranching, that had made his word law in the valley, that had allowed him to stand in a church and declare that 2 young women knew nothing about the mountains he had lived in all his life. All of it had drained away, and what remained was the face of a father who was watching his child die, and who understood, at last, that his pride was the reason there was no help to be had. Every word he spoke was arrogance, he said. His voice cracked on the word. Every judgment was blindness. Constance looked up from the boy in her arms. Her face was streaked with tears and fear, and the kind of exhaustion that goes deeper than the body. The exhaustion of a mother whose arms are the only thing between her child and the dark. "What do we do?" she said. The silence that followed was the longest of Callum Bryce's life. Then Fenrir stepped forward. His face was pale, but his voice was steady, and in that steadiness there was something new, something that had not been there before, as though the weeks of silence and guilt and secret provisions left on rocks in the dark had forged something in him that his father's certainty had always prevented from forming. The Ashcroft sisters went north, he said, toward the old hunting grounds in the foothills. There are cliff formations there, sandstone caves. If they built what they said they were going to build, that is where they are. Callum looked at his son. You knew where they went. Yes. The word was simple and devastating, and it hung in the air between father and son like a blade. You knew, and you said nothing. Yes. And you drove them out and said everything. And here we are. It was the first time Fenrir had ever spoken to his father that way. The first time anyone in that house had spoken to Callum Bryce that way. And the old rancher, who would have roared and thundered at such defiance a week ago, said nothing. Because his son was right. And because his youngest son was dying in his wife's arms. And the only people who might know how to help were two girls he had sent into the wilderness to perish. At dawn, a group of men left the Bryce Ranch and began walking north. The journey should have taken a few hours in clear weather. In the aftermath of the storm, with snow drifted higher than a man's head, and the cold so severe that exposed skin burned within minutes, it took them from dawn until the light was already leaving the sky. One man turned back within the first few hours, his strength spent. Another collapsed at the halfway point and had to be carried between two others who could barely carry themselves. The remaining men pressed forward because behind them was a dying child, and ahead of them was the only hope they had left. Callum Bryce had never known such cold. It passed through every layer of clothing he wore and settled into his bones like something that intended to live there permanently. His beard froze solid, his eyelashes crusted with ice that he had to crack away with fingers that had stopped feeling anything hours ago. His feet were distant objects that he instructed to move and that obeyed only reluctantly and with increasing delay. But he did not stop. His son was dying. His community was dying. And somewhere in these mountains, if the impossible had happened, if two orphan girls with a dead man's journal and a knife had actually done what they said they would do, there might be warmth and shelter and a chance at survival that he did not deserve, but was desperate enough to beg for. Fenrir saw the smoke first. A thin line rising from a crack in the cliff face, barely visible against the gray sky, so faint that a man looking for it could have missed it, and a man not looking for it would never have seen it at all. But it was there. Smoke meant fire, and fire meant warmth, and warmth meant life. And Fenrir pointed, and his father looked, and the old rancher's legs nearly buckled beneath him. Then the entrance. A dark gap in the red-gold sandstone, sheltered beneath a natural overhang, fitted with a wooden door so precisely carved into the rock that it appeared to have grown from the stone itself. Firewood stacked in a covered alcove, tracks in the snow, the print of a large dog, the smaller prints of horses. Callum stumbled forward through the last stretch of snow and raised his fist to knock on the door. Before his knuckles made contact, the door swung inward. Seren stood in the entrance. She was thinner than he remembered. The rationing had carved her face down to its essential structure, all cheekbone and jawline, and those storm-colored eyes that looked at him now with an expression he could not read. Behind her, warmth poured from the cave like something physical, a wave of heated air that hit the frozen men like a wall and made their damaged skin burn with the sudden change. She looked at Callum Bryce. She looked at the man who had stood in a church and declared that she knew nothing. The man who had helped take her land. The man who had voted to send her into the wilderness with nothing but her sister and a dog and a dead father's journal. She looked at him the way the mountain looked at everything, without pity and without cruelty, simply measuring what stood before her and deciding what it was worth. The silence between them was long enough to become its own kind of conversation. In it, Callum understood that he was being weighed, and that the scale being used was not one he had ever encountered before. It was not a scale of wealth or power or social position. It was a scale of truth, and on that scale, he was very, very light. "My son," he said. His frozen lips could barely shape the words. "He is 8 years old. He has a fever and a cough that brings blood. He is dying. We have no medicine, no heat. The town is dying. Many have already died. We have nowhere else to turn." From behind Seren, Marin appeared. She looked at the frozen men standing in the snow, at the ice in their beards and the desperation in their eyes, and the suffering that had been inflicted by their own refusal to listen. Her face held none of her sister's severity. It held instead a sadness so deep it was almost tender. The sadness of someone who had hoped to be wrong. "How many children are left?" she asked. Callum shook his head. His voice broke. "Dozens," he said. "Many of them children. Dozens of children." Seren heard the number, and something shifted behind her eyes. Not forgiveness, something both larger and more difficult. Children had no part in the decisions that had been made in that church. Children had not voted. Children had not laughed. Children were suffering because adults had chosen pride over wisdom, certainty over caution, and the comfort of mockery over the discomfort of preparation. She looked at Marin. A silent conversation passed between the sisters, the kind of exchange that exists only between people who have shared everything, who have carved a home from stone together, and fought with each other, and forgiven each other, and slept with their bodies pressed close for warmth in the dark. Seren saw what was in her sister's face, and Marin saw the hesitation in Seren's. Not hatred, but fear. Because this cave was designed for two. It held enough food for two, enough firewood for two, enough space for two. Inviting dozens of desperate, frozen, starving people into this space was not mercy in the abstract. It was a gamble. It meant dividing everything they had built, everything they had bled for, among people who had tried to take it all from them once already. Marin said it simply and quietly, the way she said everything that mattered. Father would have opened the door. And Seren, who had her father's knowledge and her father's stubbornness, and, it turned out, her father's inability to let people die when she had the power to save them, stepped aside. "Bring them," she said. "Bring them all. Children first, then the sick, then the others. We have room if people are willing to share space. We have food if we ration carefully. The spring does not freeze." She paused, and when she spoke again, Her voice carried an edge that was not cruelty, but the hard boundary of a woman who would not be taken advantage of again. But understand this: you are not guests. You are survivors. You will follow the rules of this house. You will work. You will contribute. And when this is over, you will remember what happened here. You will remember what happens when you silence the people who try to warn you. Callum nodded. He would have agreed to anything. He would have given his ranch, his name, his remaining years of life. "Thank you," he said. And the words sounded so small against the scale of what had been done to these girls and what they were choosing to do in return, that he nearly choked on them. Seren looked at him with an expression that was closer to acknowledgement than forgiveness. "Do not thank me," she said. "Thank my father. He taught us that the mountain does not care about grudges. It only cares about who is prepared. He also taught us that surviving when others do not is a choice to be better, not an excuse to be cruel." She stepped back into the warmth. "Bring them quickly. The light will not last." The evacuation took 3 days. Seren and Fenrir led the rescue parties, cutting paths through the snow that only Seren's knowledge of the terrain made possible. They found people in houses that were barely standing, in barns where they had retreated when their homes became uninhabitable, in the general store where the owner had burned every shelf and counter and was preparing to start on the floor. They carried children who could not walk, and supported adults who could barely stand, and led them through a frozen landscape that looked like a world from which all mercy had been removed. Most came willingly. Some came reluctantly, their shame at seeking help from the girls they had condemned written on their faces in expressions more painful than the frostbite. Reverend Silas Thornfield refused. They found him in the ruins of his church, wrapped in the frozen altar cloth, his face gaunt, his fingers blackened. He had burned everything: the pews, the risers, the font, the pulpit, the wooden cross that had hung above the altar. He sat in his chair at the front of the empty sanctuary, with nothing left to burn, and nothing left to preach to, and nothing left of the power he had spent years accumulating. Fenrir stood in the doorway and told him that the Ashcroft sisters were offering shelter, that dozens of people had already made the journey, that the cave was warm and the food was holding, and there was a chance, a real chance, to survive this if he would swallow his pride and walk. Thornfield looked at the young man with eyes that had gone strange and distant, the eyes of a man whose carefully constructed world had collapsed more completely than any roof. The words he spoke were the words of a man who had confused stubbornness with faith for so long that he could no longer tell the difference. He would not go. He would not accept salvation from the hands of those girls. He would remain in God's house and trust in God's plan. Fenrir looked at him for a long moment. He saw the frost-bitten hands and the hollow cheeks, and the altar cloth wrapped around shoulders that had once carried the weight of a community's trust. He saw a man who had wanted land and called it righteousness, who had driven 2 orphans into the wilderness and called it justice, and who now sat in the wreckage of his own making and called it faith. "Then suit yourself," Fenrir said. His voice held no anger, only the flat exhaustion of a man who had learned that you cannot save someone who has decided to be destroyed by their own certainty. He left the reverend in the frozen church. Thornfield survived. Not through prayer, and not through God's intervention, but through the mundane miracle of a neighbor who came back for him on the third day, who found him barely conscious and dragged him through the snow to a house where a fire still burned. He lived, but his fingers did not. The blackened digits were lost, along with the tip of his nose and most of his authority. He would spend the rest of his life in the valley, a diminished man, a cautionary figure whom people treated with a careful, distant pity that was worse than contempt. No one ever sat in his congregation again. No one ever called him reverend without a slight hesitation that said more than any accusation could have. He lived with consequences, and the consequences were heavier than any punishment death could have delivered. Inside Stonehaven, a small miracle of cooperation was unfolding. Nearly 70 people crowded into a space designed for 2. It should have been chaos. It should have been impossible. Seren made it work. She assigned sleeping areas based on family size and the presence of children. She established rationing protocols. She created watch schedules so that someone was always tending the fire, always monitoring the door, always checking on the sick. She moved through the crowded cave with the quiet authority of a woman who had earned the right to command by proving that her commands were worth following. Marin handled the medical emergencies. She was not a doctor, but she knew the herbs their father had cataloged in his journal, the treatments that mountain people had used for generations. She made poultices for frostbitten extremities. She brewed teas from dried rose hips to fight fever. She sat with the children through their worst hours and sang the songs their mother had sung to them. And the sound of her voice against the stone walls gave people something to hold on to when everything else had been lost. Lachlan Bryce survived. It took days, but the fever broke and the cough subsided, and the color returned to his lips. On a cold morning that might have been a holiday, and might have been just another day in the endless gray sameness of winter in a cave, the boy sat up and ate solid food for the first time in over a week. He looked around the crowded space with the clear, uncomplicated eyes of a child who has been sick and is now better, and cannot understand why the adults around him are crying. "Can the dog come here?" he asked. Ashwood, who had spent the previous days guarding the entrance and growling at every stranger who came too close to Seren, walked across the crowded cave and placed his enormous gray head in the boy's lap. Lachlan laughed, and the sound of it filled the stone chamber, the first genuine laughter anyone had heard in weeks. And people looked up from their blankets and their rationed meals and their damaged hands, and something in their faces changed. Not hope exactly, something quieter, something that felt like the first thaw after a freeze that seemed like it would never end. Fenrir found Seren standing at the entrance that evening, looking out through a gap in the door at the snow that continued to fall. The cave behind her was warm and full of the sounds of people sleeping and breathing and living, and the world outside was cold and empty and white. "I wanted to help you," he said quietly. "At the town meeting, I wanted to speak up. I was afraid." Saren did not look at him. "Fear is reasonable. Your father is a powerful man. Going against him would have cost you something. It cost more not to." "Yes, it did." They stood in silence for a long moment, listening to the wind and the fire and the breathing of the people they were keeping alive. "What matters now," Saren said, "is not what you did then. What matters is what you do when this is over, when we go back to what is left of the town. There will be choices to make, old ways of thinking to change. Will you be part of that? Or will you fall back into the old patterns?" Fenrir met her eyes. They were the eyes of a woman who had built a home inside a mountain with her bare hands, and then opened the door of that home to the people who had tried to destroy her. They were eyes that did not forgive easily and did not trust quickly, and would not accept promises made in the desperation of the moment. "Ask me that again when the storm breaks," he said, "and judge me by what I do, not by what I say I will do." Something moved in Saren's expression. Not warmth, not yet, but something that acknowledged the intelligence of a man who understood that words spoken in crisis were worth less than actions taken in calm. "Get some rest," she said. "You are on fire watch before dawn." She turned back to the snow, and Fenrir went inside, and the storm continued its patient, indifferent work of burying the world in white. The storm broke the way a fever breaks, not all at once, but in stages, the wind dying first, then the snow thinning, then a weak sun appearing over mountains that had been transformed into something unrecognizable. The world outside Stonehaven was white and silent and enormous. A landscape stripped of every familiar landmark, every fence post and trail marker and tree line, buried beneath drifts that climbed higher than a man could reach. Serene unsealed the door on the first morning of stillness and stepped outside. The cold was still severe, but without the wind, it had lost its malice. It was simply cold now, the ordinary cold of winter in the mountains, bearable if you kept moving and kept your face covered and did not stay out longer than the work required. She stood in the snow and breathed and looked out at the valley below. Nothing moved. No smoke rose from the town. No cattle dotted the white fields. The world looked as though it had been emptied of everything that had ever lived in it, scrubbed clean and left to dry in the pale winter sun. Behind her, the survivors began to emerge. They came blinking into the brightness like creatures born underground, shielding their eyes against the glare of sunlight on snow, their faces carrying the particular expression of people who have survived something they did not expect to survive and do not yet know what that means or what it will cost them to remember it. The return to the valley took most of the day. They walked in a long column through the snow, following paths that Saren had memorized during the autumn, paths that were invisible now beneath the drifts, but that she navigated with a certainty that no one questioned anymore. Children rode on the backs of adults. The injured were carried on stretchers improvised from aspen poles and blankets. Sindra and Flint helped pull a sled loaded with the few supplies that could be spared. Ashwood ranged ahead of the group, his gray body moving through the white landscape like a ghost, his senses alert for dangers that no longer existed because the storm had killed or buried everything that might have posed a threat. The town was in ruins. Roofs had collapsed under the weight of snow that no one had built for. Walls had buckled inward. Doors hung open on houses that had been abandoned when the wood ran out and the cold moved in. The cattle that had died stood frozen in the fields, half buried, their bodies rigid and strange, monuments to a confidence that had not been earned. The church still stood, mostly. Its steeple had snapped and lay half buried in a drift. The windows were shattered, the door hanging from one hinge. Inside, the sanctuary, where Thornfield had burned every piece of wood and prayed for deliverance, was empty and cold and silent. The altar cloth was gone. The pews were gone. The cross was gone. There was nothing left except stone walls and the smell of old smoke and the memory of a man who had confused his hunger for power with a calling from God. They found the dead in the days that followed, in houses where the fuel had run out, in barns where people had retreated seeking the warmth of animals that were already frozen, in snowdrifts near doorways, people who had stepped outside for wood or water and never found their way back. Old Arvid, curled in the snow 20 feet from his cabin, his face peaceful, his body frozen into the position of a man who had simply decided to rest. The doctor, who had survived his broken leg and the collapse of his house, but had not survived the infection that followed, dying in a neighbor's spare room, with his scientific certainties scattered around him like the pages of a book whose binding had given way. Dozens dead. The precise number did not matter and would never be agreed upon, because some of the bodies would not be found until the spring thaw, and some would never be found at all. What mattered was the weight of the number, pressing down on the survivors like the snow had pressed down on their roofs, bending them, reshaping them, making them into something different than what they had been before. The gathering took place in the open space before the ruined church. It was the largest clear area available, and there was a certain fitness to holding this meeting in view of the building where so much wrong had been done. The survivors stood in the trampled snow and looked at each other with the raw, stripped faces of people who have lost the ability to pretend. Callum Bryce spoke first. He stood before his neighbors, the people he had led and advised, and whose respect he had enjoyed for longer than many of them had been alive, and the authority that had always lived in his voice was gone. In its place was something unfamiliar and difficult and more honest than anything he had ever said from a position of strength. Every word spoken in that church was arrogance, he said. Every judgment made was blindness. 2 young women tried to warn us, and we drove them out. We took their land. We mocked their knowledge. And everything they said would happen, happened. My son would be dead if not for them. My wife. My family. Everyone standing here would be frozen in the ruins of houses that we were too proud to admit could not protect us. His voice broke, and he let it break, and he did not try to repair it, because the breaking was the truest thing about what he was saying. He turned to face Seren and Marin, who stood apart from the crowd, with Ashwood at their feet and Sindra and Flint tethered nearby. The 2 sisters looked back at him with expressions that held no triumph and no satisfaction and no warmth only the steady, evaluating gaze of people who had been given every reason to hate and were deciding, moment by moment, what to do with that reason. Other voices followed. Virgil Dawson, his damaged hands wrapped in bandages, spoke about the $5 bet he had made, and the roof that had collapsed, and the night he had carried his sister through the snow, and understood for the first time in his life that confidence without knowledge was just a louder kind of ignorance. He offered to work for the sisters for a full year without pay. He said it not with the grand gesture of a man performing penance, but with the quiet shame of a man who understood that a year of labor could not undo a moment of cruelty, but who did not know what else to offer. Constance Bryce spoke of holding her dying son in her arms and praying for a miracle, and the miracle arriving in the form of 2 young women and a cave carved into a mountain, and a tea brewed from rose hips that brought a fever down when nothing else could. She wept as she spoke, and many wept with her, because her story was their story, all of them. The story of people who had been saved by the very ones they had condemned. Bridget Holmgren did not speak. The old widow stood at the edge of the crowd with her arms folded and her jaw set, and watched the proceedings with the expression of a woman who had tried to prevent this disaster and been threatened for her trouble, and was not yet ready to forgive the people who had ignored her any more than she was ready to forgive herself for not fighting harder. Through all of this, the sisters listened. They let the words wash over them the way water washes over stone, taking what it takes and leaving the rest. When the testimonies ended, Seren stepped forward. She was not yet 20 years old, but she spoke with the authority of someone who had earned every syllable through labor and loss, and the refusal to let either one define her. "The mountains do not judge," she said. "They do not care if a person is rich or poor, wise or foolish, old or young. They care only about who is prepared and who is not. They care only about who listens and who refuses to hear." She paused and let the silence do its work. People are different from mountains. People judge. People fear what they do not understand. People silence the voices that make them uncomfortable. But people can also change. They can learn from what they have done wrong. They can become better than they were. Her gaze moved across the crowd, meeting the eyes of those who had wronged her, one by one, without flinching and without softening. "Forgiveness is not something that can be offered today," she said. "Perhaps it will come with time. Perhaps it will not. But the children are alive, and that matters more than grudges. And if anyone here wants to learn what the mountains have been trying to teach since long before any of us were born, the knowledge is here. It will not die with the people who carry it. It will be taught to anyone willing to learn." Marin stepped forward to stand beside her sister. She did not make a speech. She simply stood there, and her presence said what needed to be said. That this was not one sister's decision, but 2. That the knowledge and the mercy and the hard-edged generosity came from both of them, from the same source, passed down through the same bloodline, carried in different ways by different hands to the same conclusion. "So let us start," Marin said, and she smiled, and it was the first genuine smile anyone in that crowd had seen since the sky turned the color of bone and the world went white. The rebuilding began that same week. The land was returned. The territorial office, when the paperwork finally arrived months later, found no irregularity in the claim. The rumors of improper filing had been lies, manufactured by a man who wanted what did not belong to him, and who now sat in a borrowed chair in a borrowed room, staring at his bandaged hands. A man whose congregation had dissolved, and whose authority had evaporated, and whose name would be spoken in the valley for generations to come, but never with respect. Saren taught. She taught every family that came to Stonehaven how to read the signs that the natural world offered freely to anyone patient enough to observe them. She taught them about earth-sheltered construction, about thermal mass, about the way stone holds warmth and releases it slowly through the dark hours. She taught them which plants could sustain life in winter, and which could heal wounds and fight fever. She taught them how to prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. And she taught them without sentimentality and without preaching, because she had learned from her father that knowledge delivered with humility lasted longer than knowledge delivered with righteousness. Within a few seasons, new shelters dotted the valley. Not caves like Stonehaven, but root cellars and storm shelters and reinforced outbuildings designed to work with the land instead of against it. The people of the town had learned their lesson. Not all of them, and not all at once. Because people are not mountains, and change does not come to them as easily as snow comes to the peaks. A small group still whispered that the sisters had simply been lucky, that the storm was a fluke, that next winter would be normal, and all this preparation was wasted effort. But the following winter, when the cold returned and the families with shelters sat warm while the doubters shivered, the whispers grew quieter. And the winter after that, they stopped altogether. Not because anyone made a speech about it, but because reality is a more patient teacher than pride, and it always arrives eventually. Fenrir returned to Stonehaven in the spring after the great winter. He came to learn, he said. Then he came to help with construction. Then he came because the trail between the ranch and the cliff face had become so familiar that his feet followed it without instruction. Eventually, he stopped pretending and admitted what anyone with eyes had known for months. Saren did not make it easy. She did not encourage or flatter. She treated him exactly as she treated every other student who came to learn, with patience and directness, and a complete absence of anything that resembled romantic performance. But she noticed. She noticed the way he worked without complaint, the way he treated Marin with respect, the way he played with Lachlan during the boys' visits, patient and gentle with a child who adored him. The way he never spoke about what he had done or failed to do in the church, because he understood that the past was not erased by talking about it, but by living differently in the present. When he asked her to marry him, she refused, not out of cruelty, but out of honesty. She did not need rescue. She did not need completion. She had survived things that would have killed most people, and she had done it on her own terms and with her own hands. And she would not diminish that by pretending she needed anything she did not need. Fenrir nodded. He was not surprised. He said he was not offering rescue. He was asking to stand beside her. There was a difference, and he hoped she could see it. "Ask again in the spring," she said. And there was something in her voice that was not a promise, but was not a refusal either. He asked again when the snow melted and the creek ran high and the valley turned green in the way that only mountain valleys turn green, sudden and complete and almost violent in its beauty. And this time, she said yes. Marin never married. She had found something that interested her more than partnership. She had a gift with animals that deepened as the years passed. A way of communicating across species that the people who witnessed it could not explain and did not try to. Ranchers brought their most difficult horses. Farmers brought livestock that refused to be handled. And Marin, quiet and patient, with her mother's gentle mouth and her father's watchful eyes, reached them all. She lived at Stonehaven for the rest of her life, sharing the space she had helped carve from the mountain. And on the afternoons when the light was golden and the wind was still, she could be seen standing in the meadow below the cliff, surrounded by horses, her hand resting on the neck of whatever new creature had been brought to her. And she would be smiling the way her mother smiled in the one memory she still carried of the woman who had taught her the old songs. The story could end there. In some tellings, it does. But stories, like mountains, have layers. And the deepest layer is always about what remains after the people who made the story are gone. Many years after the Great Winter, when Seren's hair had turned the color of the stone she had carved, and her hands were mapped with scars that each told their own story, she sat at the entrance of Stonehaven on a quiet evening. The valley spread out below her, dotted with the shelters and structures that her teaching had inspired, a landscape that bore the marks of knowledge passed from hand to hand, generation to generation, the way a river passes water from the mountains to the sea. She opened her father's journal. The pages were soft now, worn thin by years of handling, the ink fading in places where her fingers had traced the words so many times that the paper had begun to surrender its markings. She turned to the last entry, the sentence that stopped in the middle, the ink smeared by rain that had fallen on the day her father died. For a long time she simply looked at the unfinished thought, at the space after it where the page was blank, at the emptiness that had once felt like loss and now felt like something else, like an invitation, like a door left open. She reached into the pocket of her coat and took out a pen. She held it above the blank space for a moment, feeling its weight, feeling the weight of everything that had brought her to this exact point in her life, to this seat, in front of this cave, on this mountain, in this valley, where she had been cast out and had returned and had taught and had built and had chosen again and again to be better than the circumstances that had made her. She placed the pen on the page and began to write. What she wrote is not recorded. The words she added to her father's journal were for her and for the people who would come after her, and they belonged to the mountain the way everything eventually belongs to the mountain. But the act itself, the act of picking up where her father left off, of continuing a sentence he could not finish, of adding her knowledge to his, and trusting that someone would one day add theirs to hers, that act was the truest legacy she could have left. Not the cave, though the cave still stood. Not the techniques, though the techniques were still practiced. The legacy was the continuation. The proof that knowledge does not die with the person who carries it, that it passes on, hand to hand, voice to voice, page to page, through every winter and every silence, and every moment when the easy thing would be to let it go, and the right thing is to hold on. Ashwood slept at the entrance, his muzzle gray, his breathing slow and deep. Inside the cave, Marin's voice drifted out, singing one of the old songs to someone, a child perhaps, or a student, or simply to the stone walls that had heard those songs so many times they had become part of the rock itself. The wind moved through the valley, the light faded. The mountains stood where they had always stood, and would always stand, patient and indifferent and eternal, caring nothing for the stories of the small creatures who lived and died in their shadows. But the small creatures told stories anyway. They carved homes into the stone and taught their children what they knew, and wrote in journals that would outlast them, and opened doors when opening was harder than keeping them shut. They chose mercy when mercy cost them something. They chose to teach when silence would have been easier. They chose, again and again, in ways large and small, and ordinary and extraordinary, to be better than the cold. And the mountains, which did not care, held them anyway, held their heat and their stories and their small, stubborn, beautiful lives, the way stone holds the memory of every hand that has ever touched it, long after the hand is gone.